All right, y'all. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome again. Thank you all for joining us for our masterclass with Adrienne Maree Brown entitled Emergent Strategy in Social Justice. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Megan Pugh. I'm the director of the Office of Multicultural Affairs here at UNC Asheville. And today, as you all know, we are lucky, very, very fortunate to have writer, educator, activist, and facilitator Adrienne Maree Brown joining us to discuss her renowned work, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, and sharing ways that we can implement the text's major themes in our collective organizing for social change. Um, just know as we go through the talk, you can feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll see how many we get through today. But before I formally introduce our guest, I'd like to honor those lost to white supremacist violence, names and stories known and unknown, because I'm sure there are many that we don't know of, with a short moment of silence. So if you would. Thank you so much. Um, Adrienne Maree Brown is the writer in residence at the Emergent Strategy Ideation Institute and author of Holding Change, the way of Emergent Strategy Facilitation and Mediation, We Will Not Cancel Us, and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice, Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, and the co-editor of Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction from Social Justice Movements, which is a personal favorite of mine, and How to Get Stupid White Men Out of Office. She is the co-host of How to Survive the End of the World, Octavia's Parables, and Emergent Strategy podcasts. Adrienne is rooted in Detroit. Adrienne, thank you so much for being with us. As I mentioned to you all, this will sort of be, a conversation. But Adrienne, I will start with you, and if there's anything you'd like to share, feel free.
Beautiful. Hi, everyone. Welcome to lunch. Um, it's funny, when I looked at this on my calendar, it was like masterclass with Adrienne Maree Brown. And I was like, "Ugh, what do I know about this stuff?" So I'm going to share with you just a little bit about what I know. But one of the important things to me about emergent strategy is that I feel like a student of it. Um, I feel like I'm still constantly learning and unfolding and unraveling. Like, what does it mean to see the world through this lens, which I think is the lens that the world kind of wants to be seen through, is a lens of being a teacher, being a relative, many, many relatives. And I also want to honor that I think it is a way for me as a displaced person and others who have been displaced from their original indigenous relationship to Earth to rediscover, to find our way back to being in some kind of right relationship. And it's Earth Day. So I feel like it's a good day to get to talk about emergent strategy, because so much of emergent strategy is actually being like, look at this beautiful wow of a planet that we are on and the symbiotic relationship we get to be in with it. So fundamentally, emergent strategy is how do we get ourselves in right relationship with change, recognizing that change is the fundamental constant process of this universe that we live in. And I was introduced to the ideas, or started to have my eyes open to these ideas, by a Black science fiction writer named Octavia Butler. And tonight, I'm going to be diving a lot deeper into the relationship I have with Octavia Butler's work. But I want to name it here because she's so fundamental to what I understand to be emergent strategy. A part of emergent strategy is being able to be visionary about how we see the world, to understand that if we don't get into a relationship with change, then the future is a place that we're not going to want to be, a place that doesn't imagine us in it, a place that doesn't have room for us. And if we actually start to get involved, we can shape the future into a place that we can coexist and not just survive, but thrive. Um, so she's part of the lineage, but there's other parts of the lineage too. There's a writer named Margaret Wheatley who wrote a book called Leadership in the New Sciences, and I highly recommend that as a read. A lot of it is about complexity science, and I'm not a scientist, but the way she wrote about it made it feel accessible to me. I don't think of myself as a scientist. Like, I feel like if I was around actual scientists, they would laugh at me. And I do experiments and I do scientific method all the time, and I do hypotheses, and I do looking at the natural world and trying to understand what will happen, what could happen. I notice patterns. So in those ways, you know, maybe I'm a scientist of some sort, but there's these beautiful concepts of fractals and complexity and chaos that are all around us in this world that we live in. And I started to ask myself what it would look like to understand those concepts for humans based on the work of Margaret Wheatley, to understand what it could look like if we could avoid predation like a flock of birds. What would it look like if we could process toxins in our being the way mushrooms can process toxins in soil? They process it completely, so that if you test the soil, there's no toxin in the soil, there's no toxin in the mushroom. It's just is gone. I'm like, what would it look like for that to be the case for sexual assault, to have processed the toxin so completely that it no longer was possible? Um, I started asking myself these questions, and my work has been social justice facilitation. So holding change, holding social justice organizations and environmental justice organizations and change processes. And as I started looking at the patterns of what we were learning, I was like, this is complexity. This is emergence, right? Emergence, the word emergence is really the way complex systems and patterns arise out of relatively simple interactions, right? Nick Oblinsky teaches us that. So I was asking myself that, like, what would it look like to see all of the emergence, the complex patterns that are arising out of our simple interactions? And then what kind of interactions do we have to have if we want a different complex pattern to emerge, right? That's how I think of abolitionism, right? It's like, I want to end the prison industrial complex. That means a new complex pattern has to emerge, right? So that's emergent strategy in the like broadest nutshell. There's a lot in there about adaptation. There's a lot in there about smallness and understanding that every large system, large structure is made up of small, small, small parts. And the small is where we need to actually practice if we want to grow something different at a large scale. There's a lot in there about relationship, interdependence, decentralization, trust. And what does it mean to trust each other into trustworthiness? What does it mean to trust each other with boundaries, trust each other with consent, trust each other to change? And fundamentally, it's about creating more possibilities. We live right now in a society where it feels like there's actually not a lot of options for us for getting free or for being different than we were trained to be or socialized to be. And I think the work of an emergent strategist is to create more possibilities, to remind us that the healthiest ecosystems are the most diverse, the most many ways of being coexisting. That's what works in nature, and we are in nature. So that's the nutshell. And I think there's questions. So I thought most of the time we could spend me hearing those questions and letting that shape. Hi, doggy. Hello, cutie pie. OMG, other doggy. Hi, other doggy. They're like, are you getting attention on the camera? Because I'm also here. Yeah, so what questions do you have for me?
Yeah, thank you. I think I know a lot of you folks that are on here today, but for those I don't know, I'm Corey. I work in the Key Center and I work closely with Megan. So thanks again for everybody coming. And thank you, Adrienne, for that overview and sort of definition of emergent strategy. We have a few questions that were submitted by students ahead of time, but I just wanted y'all to know if you have more questions, because I feel like you're going to get inspired and your imaginations are going to start sparking. Please feel free to put them into the chat. I'm not sure we'll be able to cover everything, but we'll do our best. So we're going to start off with another sort of overview or definition. We have a group of students that wanted to ask if you could share a definition for pleasure activism for those who are not familiar with that term, and talk a little bit about that.
Oh yeah, pleasure activism is such a delightful area of study. You know, pleasure is happy satisfaction and enjoyment, contentment. And so the activism around it is activism that allows us the freedom to experience those things. One of the core questions of pleasure activism is, are you satisfiable? Are you satisfied, and are you satisfiable? And the activism work, a lot of the activism work around it is in the effort to reclaim our right to satisfaction, our right to living satisfied lives, our right to having joy and feeling our own erotic aliveness, in spite of what oppression and supremacy myths have taught us, which is that only a few people deserve pleasure and everyone else should be in service and labor and production to those people experiencing pleasure. So a lot of it is rooted in the work of Audre Lorde. I highly recommend going back and reading the original text, The Uses of the Erotic as Power, which she published in 1978. And I included that in pleasure activism because I was like, this text is mind-blowing. You can actually look on the internet and find an audio of her reading it. There's like this video with her picture and this audio of her reading the essay aloud, which I think is a good way to experience it the first time if you haven't yet. So she asked that question, or she raises this idea that once you have experienced erotic aliveness, it becomes impossible to settle for suffering and self-negation and these states of inequality that we become used to. And I thought that was such a shell shock of a concept. I was like, oh, it's the aliveness that makes that impossible, not fighting and being mired in the suffering and in the suffering together. And a lot of what pleasure activism looks at is, what are the places where we currently experience pleasure and how do we liberate ourselves within those areas? How do we make sure that in the realms of sex that we're actually practicing consent and practicing healing and practicing right relationship and practicing using our voice and practicing loving our bodies as they are in such a way that we actually get to be liberated in the experience. In the realm of drugs, it's like, how do we practice harm reduction so that a drug use experience does not mean jail and does not mean overdose and does not mean addiction, but can actually just be an experience of pleasure, of spiritual awakening and opening. And pleasure also includes a lot of things that aren't sex and drugs. So pleasure activism looks at comedy, it looks at love, it looks at care, especially care across abilities and needs. It looks at writing and creativity and answering the call of your life and what a huge pleasure it is to actually be in alignment with what you're meant to do rather than giving your life away to massive systems. So the definition in the book is like a full page of things because I was like, it's like a lot that's happening there, but yeah, that's pleasure activism.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think if y'all are interested, you can definitely read that book to get more of it. But thank you for that. Carla, I just wanted to say we have your questions. Thank you for listing them in the chat. I appreciate that from the class, and we'll get to those for sure. So second question from a group of students was, could you please talk a little bit about the importance of wonder in your work?
Mm-hmm. I feel like imagination and wonder go hand in hand, like being able to see things that actually expand your sense of awareness and aliveness. That wonder is something that we actually have a common experience of. Most of us have experienced wonder in our lives and we can tap back into it. It's also a measure for me when we are experiencing hopelessness, like hopelessness kind of goes at odds with wonder. So bringing wonder back into communities can actually reignite the part of us that wants to be alive, that finds it compelling to be alive, that finds it powerful to be alive. So I feel like a lot of wonder flows through emergent strategy, flows through pleasure activism. There's this consistent invitation, even though we're often drawn to bring our attention to what is the worst of humanity, the worst of society, what is the worst that's going on. Wonder is constantly inviting us back to also look at how incredible and miraculous we are, how deeply we care for each other, how interdependent we are. So yeah, I think wonder is a very important part of my work.
All right. How do you navigate the fine line between toxic positivity and imagining the utopian world, one without oppressive institutions and their effects?
Well, I would say, and I'll talk about this some tonight, but I've really worked with the concept of visionary fiction from Alida Imarisha. Like we put that was the core of what we did for Octavia's Brood. And the idea of how we're imagining the future is actually not the utopian world. We talk about in most of the futures that we want, it's not dystopian, it's not utopian. That it's very rare for utopias to exist without dystopias supporting them. So most of the time it's like when we say a utopia, what we mean is like no one has to labor, which means the labor is unseen, which is actually what the very wealthy or the very privileged experience right now. So for me, I really try to veer away from a utopian worldview, but I try to lean into something that feels hopeful and realistic, right? It's like, actually, we know how to practice these things. We are learning how to practice these things at a very small scale. I think toxic positivity often comes when we're trying to grow an idea of knowing how to do something before we actually know how to do it. So people are like, oh, we know how to heal. Everyone can heal. I'm like, no, honey, you might have healed, or you might have had a moment of healing, or you might have had a day of healing, but that doesn't mean that's something we figured out how to do on mass scale. A lot of people who are in the healing industry or the health and wellness industry are people who individually have been able to access the resources they need for their healing, but have not necessarily figured out how do we make that a collective experience. So I think the thing that makes something toxic, because positivity in general is like, yeah, positivity, what's wrong with that? That's great. But a lot of what makes it toxic is that it's not connected to community, and it's not connected to how does everyone gets to access this. Part of why pleasure activism was important to me was because I was like, I'm figuring out how to do some of this healing work because I've got a therapist and I've got an acupuncturist and I've got like these resources that are in my community, and I don't have a lot of money, which I always thought I was going to have in order to be happy, or in order to be well, or in order to have stability. And it became interesting to me, like, can other people figure this out? Can we all figure out how to experience more liberation in the one thing we all have, which is just our bodies? I also want to uplift that, and this is very old, you know, Khalil Gibran wrote this, our sorrow carves out the space for our joy, right? That I actually don't know that you can experience one thing without the other in a meaningful life. So this week is a week full of grief, and a week full of hardship, and a week full of like being reminded of powerlessness or being reminded of these systems. And it doesn't mean we don't also experience great joy and connectivity and love inside of that. That's what helps us want to stay alive and keep fighting for these things. But I feel the most satisfied in my life when I'm able to feel the full range of emotions. And that's the way I try to write. That's the way I try to think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for that reminder about this week in particular too.
Yeah.
All right, so another question from a student, and it was noted that this question is from a Black woman.
Okay.
How do you navigate being in these spaces and trying not to be tokenized as a light-skinned person? Obviously, this isn't completely in our control, but Black femmes and women are often tokenized and idolized in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I try to say and do things to make sure white people don't get too comfortable, and I'm wondering about how you do that.
I love this question. I feel like, to me, one of the things that's been really interesting is this has been a fairly recent question in my life. Like, for the longest time in my organizing, it was just like, we're Black and we're just dealing with being Black and we're dealing with being Black and fat and queer and like all these things. And then it's only in the last few years when I've had more visibility that I've suddenly been like, but what about your light skin? Like, how is that showing up? And I'm like, I don't know. It wasn't showing up for years. I was like not able to get ahead of anything. Just like, I'm broke and I don't have anything and I'm organizing. And so one of the things for me is to keep in mind that I'm not rooting into or leaning into the way people view me based on light skin, that I'm leaning into the work that I've done. And that always feels really important to me, that I'm like, okay. And one of the examples I'll give of this is people, because I have visibility now, will reach out to me and ask me to talk about any old thing, right? They're like, oh, we've seen you and you're Black, so you must know about this specific thing over here. And I'm like, I mean, I could probably give you an opinion about it, but I'm not a pundit. I don't know anything about, for instance, like the healthcare system, I know very little about, so I don't give speeches about the healthcare system, but I have been asked to come and reflect on trends of Blackness in healthcare and stuff like that. And I'm like, why would you ask me that? It doesn't make any sense. The things that so what my practice has been is really figuring out, how do I make sure I'm constantly rooting into work that I've actually done. Each of the books that I've written is like, here's something I've studied, here's something I've facilitated, here's something I've worked on, here's something I've done. The other thing I do is almost anytime anyone hears me speak or anyone reads my writing, I'm referring to other Black femmes, other Black trans people, other Black scholars, other Black people, right? And that's because I recognize that it's not just that I have light skin, it's that I actually grew up in a multiracial environment, right? I have a white mother and a Black father. And I think that actually creates the accessibility that white people feel towards the way that I speak or the way I communicate, much more than the actual light skin. I know a lot of light skinned Black people who don't have a white parent or a white proximity. And so when people hear them speak, they don't feel like, oh, I have an access to whiteness in somewhere. I can feel whiteness presence here. What I feel is like I have an imprint that comes from having grown up in a space that had equal access to a Black and a white parent. And you can feel that, I think, in the way that I communicate. And so one of the things I do is say, then that makes me some kind of gateway, some kind of opening that people can use to access. And I'm like, if you're going to open this door, I want you to access Blackness, more and more Blackness through this door. So when I talk about transformative justice, I'm like, go read Miriam Kaba, right? She is this incredible Black writer, and she's the one who's been teaching me. When people want to talk about science fiction or imaginary, radical imagination, I'm like, let's talk about Octavia Butler. She's a Black woman who grew up in Pasadena, and this was her experience of being a laborer who also wrote incredible fiction. When we talk about pleasure activism, like, I will not talk about it without talking about Audre Lorde, and so on and so forth. And to me, calling in the lineage that we actually learned from is one of the best practices I know of being able to be in right relationship to whatever it is we've been given. I think it also helps to not deny it, right? To not deny that in this time, in this place, and in this country, that any proximity to whiteness is automatically marked in some way as something you're supposed to want, right? It's something you're supposed to move towards. And I think that's one of the myths of white supremacy that we're unfolding, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have impact. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have impact. So I would never say that there's people that I don't have more access to because of light skin. I will also not deny that that's something I work on and pay attention to, right? It's like, oh, I need to do both of those things. I also know a lot of our current political environment is trying to figure out, I'm trying to think of how to say this, trying to figure out the ways to divide something that is growing in a massive way and starting to have massive impact. So abolitionist movements are actually having massive impact. Black movements are having massive impact. So I don't think it's an accident that there's all these divisive questions arising of like, well, is that person really real? Is that person really good? Is that person really Black? Is that person really this and that person really that? Because those questions are really great for the divide and conquer strategy, which has always kept us unable to have the massive impact. So it's like we take it in stride, we have the conversations, but we don't, to me, the important thing is not to let it deter us from the massive successful movements we are making forward on these issues. Like the idea that, even as Minneapolis is going through this moment, even as we're like, oh, Ma'Khia Bryant has pulled our attention over to grieve in this place. But we also have to look at like Minneapolis in the last year has gone from where they were to having this verdict come back guilty and having a defunding the police campaign actually unfolding at the level of the city. That's huge. That's massive. A lot of people don't want that kind of thing to happen, right? The best thing they can do to not have that happen is to divide us against each other. So that's one of the things I take responsibility for too. I'm like, if my light skin privilege is getting in the way of our movement, I will step all the way out of the way. I'd rather do that than, I've stepped out of almost every position of leadership because of that. I'm like, I don't want this to be something that can take away from the work that's moving forward. I'll just be over here writing my little fiction books,
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll be over here reading them.
I'm like, it's a great question though. It's a great question. I appreciate it.
All right. We're going to ask one more question that was submitted before the class by a student, and then we're going to open it up to get y'all to talk and ask questions live.
Better be ready.
Yeah. So, okay. How would you address the concern that getting used to the word hierarchy, if it's based on skill and experience, can still perpetuate harm, given that it's an idea in which individual value is quantified by the skills a person brings to the table, and this has been used in the past to render certain people disposable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, Octavia like jumps up on my shoulder. She's like, see, I told y'all. One of the things Octavia wrote into one of her books was that the core flaw, the fatal flaw of humanity, was how we balanced hierarchy and intelligence. That the fact that we have this incredible intelligence, but we only use it to enact hierarchies over each other. And yet, I also know that I have been very comfortable in hierarchies with my elders, for instance, with people like I was mentored by Grace Lee Boggs. And when I met her, she was 92 years old. And I felt both very at ease being in a relationship with her because she didn't hold it like I'm better than you the whole time. But I also felt a lot of humility in her presence to be able to be like, you've lived 3 times as long as me. And so there's things that I think you probably know or have thought about, and I want to learn from that. I think that hierarchies are safest when they're intellectual, when they're about mentorship and growth and development. I think that hierarchies become very dangerous when they're structural. So when we have hierarchies where we are giving people power over each other to do work that actually needs to all be shared work. And I think what hierarchies do is they blend us very well into the structures of capitalism that are like, because hierarchies are about efficiency. Fundamentally, it's like, it takes too long to all figure this out together. It takes too long to build the relationships it would take to do this all together. So hierarchy allows us to cut the corner and be like, okay, this person now, they'll make the decision and they'll be responsible for the decision. I think when people hold a critique of hierarchy, though, the question I ask them is, what collective are you in currently? Where are you doing cooperative work currently? Because it's not enough to critique it as an idea if we're not also building up the lived experience of some other way of practicing with each other. And I was running a facilitation training with my team the past few days, and this conversation came up around how people love to attack hierarchies, but romanticize collectives and will not practice collectives. Like will not actually get into collective structures. And what I'm seeing right now is a wave of people critiquing the decisions that happen in hierarchical structures. But because I was there, because I was witnessing a lot of these things as a facilitator, I saw how rarely people actually wanted to show up for collective processes and take the time needed to show up well in those processes. And it's so frustrating because as a facilitator, you don't really get to talk about this stuff much. I kind of break the rules there and I'm just like, I'm just going to talk about all this stuff. But mostly as a facilitator, you're part of the container, right? You're not supposed to be holding a lot of opinion about what's unfolding within. You're supposed to be supporting the group. And then we're in these moments of history where it's like, okay, hierarchy, I've seen it help. I won't deny that I've seen it help. I've seen it work. The places where I really love hierarchy, I will admit, are when I'm on a direct action team. If I am part of a direct action, then I want the person there who knows how to tie knots the best and is like running the show. I want that person to just make the decisions and tell us where we need to move and move very quickly. When we're actually in action on the street, I don't want to be sitting there trying to be in a consensus process. Like, should we go this way or that way? Like the police are coming, do we need to do this or that? I'm like, no, I want an efficiency of decision making, but I want it built on trust that we are constantly growing outside of that urgent direct action moment. And I think that's where the complexity enters in. I also feel like, there is the question earlier about light skin. There's an idolization that also happens around hierarchy, where it's like whoever ends up at the top of the hierarchy is somehow like they're a great leader. they're a better leader. And one of the things I often point out is our leaders very rarely know more about what they're doing. They're just more willing to take it on. So when you see like, especially Black and brown women leaders in places, a lot of times it's like that person was willing to take it on. And they were willing to take the microaggressions, and they were willing to take the projections, and willing to take the assumptions of martyrdom. They were willing to take it on and just like stay and keep doing the work. They were the one who looked at the to-do list and they said, I'll do these 2 things. And then when everyone dropped their other tasks, they stepped up and did all those things too. Right. And so that doesn't mean that we know how to do our jobs. You know, I was an executive director for 5 years, and the whole time I was just like, I literally can't figure this out. I don't know how to make a budget. You know, I'm supposed to be responsible for like $1 million. I never had any money. I don't know how to do this. And so I think sometimes we use hierarchy as a way to actually punish those who say yes to doing the work, instead of the reason I love cooperatives or collectives or shared decision making, shared directorships and stuff like that, is because then no single person is responsible for continuously taking the brunt of it, but we share the labor. And yeah, so my biggest thing, I'm like, if you have that critique of hierarchy, get into the practice of collectivism, get in, even if it's a small space, even if it's just in your family or with your friend group, start getting into the practice of making decisions together, ideating together, taking turns, taking out the trash. Like, don't leave any piece of work that you think is like, that work is for someone lesser than me. That's how it starts within us, you know?
Thank you. And actually, there's some comments from London, and I've actually heard London talk similarly about her previous role in SGA with hierarchy and leadership. London, do you want to ask any questions, or you just had comments in the chat? Because we're going to open it up now for students to respond, ask questions.
Yeah, I was just kind of agreeing with what you were saying. And I didn't really like know abolition was an option until like this summer. And so I've been like newer to like leftist spaces, and like specifically like the leftist spaces in Asheville, which really the only ones I can speak on. They are mostly white. Like Asheville is mostly white.
Yeah.
And I've like had like very recently and just throughout the summer in like microaggressed ways, these like conversations with like so-called white leftists for the BLM movement that like say they're for this movement and say we need to listen to Black voices and like say they need to do this, that, and the other, but then when it's time for Black people to tell them what to do, they're like, wait, like what? And like, oh, well, that's hierarchical. And I'm like, this is my protest. Like, what do you mean? And like,
Yeah.
and it's just, yeah. And I don't think I had the wording for it, where I'd be like, what do you mean? Like, this is a Black Lives Matter protest. And like, yes, it's all of our responsibilities, but like, we can center the people who should be centered and equitably listen to the people that we should be listening to, and it not be like some kind of recreation of white supremacy. And I think that was like a card that was pulled out a lot, where they'd say like we're out, because I would just be like, I don't care about your white opinion, and they'd be like, what? Like, man, like, and I'm like, what? Like, it's like not what the priority is here. And I think that they would like feel, you know, like it was like a recreation of white supremacy, but it's like these structures and hierarchies that have been placed that have silenced Black and brown and poor and disabled and queer folks for so long, in order to make up for the things that have happened and like make our voices heard and make sure we can like make that impact. The role is going to have to be reversed sometimes to even out like the things that have happened in some ways. I don't think that's like a perfect math, but you know what I mean? Where like Black queer women should be the leadership of a lot of things until we can get to a place where we can be equal and like do more collective things, especially when we have that sense of urgency of like being in a really dangerous situation, like at a protest that's like needs quick thinking. Like we don't have time to hear the white baby leftist thoughts on a Black Lives Matter protest when the police are like marching towards us.
No, I mean, I think that I really appreciate what you're saying, London, because I also think that one of the things that happens in multiracial spaces is that we are, just because we have a really good intention of being in a multiracial space in a really different way, doesn't mean we have any actual lived experience of for white people of taking leadership from Black people, and for Black people of being in comradeship, like right relationship with white people. Like we don't have that. Neither side necessarily has that, but then we're showing up in multiracial organizing spaces like, hey. And one of the things I'm always trying to do for the organization that I was with for 5 years was called the Ruckus Society. And our whole work was training people in nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience. And it was a multiracial organizing space, out of which several other things have bloomed, including the Blackout Direct Action group, which now trains people in doing direct action as Black folks. And one of the pieces that we were sitting with was a lot of the expertise in how to do these actions was still with white people, because they had had a lot of practice and a lot of freedom to do so, right? There's like, you can do this direct action without necessarily being shot in the street, where we don't necessarily have the freedom to do that. So we're still learning how to do these things. And some of the best multiracial organizing I saw was the kind where there was never a moment where we had to say, I don't care about your voice, right? It's like, I care about your voice, but the location and the timing really matters. So if you want to have an opinion, a conversation about opinion, a conversation around strategy, we'll do that when we're having a strategy moment. But if you want to have an action moment where we're asking you to take action on our behalf, then we need you to actually show up as a body, as guard, as a layer of defense and protection, who's using your privilege, right? Which you said you didn't ask for and you said you don't want. So you're using that privilege in order to let us advance this thing that we couldn't advance. And the thing that was hard for me inside of it was, as a Black person, learning to see the humanity of the white people I was working with, because I was so angry at the white people I was up against. And then I was like, and then you're also white standing next to me, and so there was this piece where I was like, oh wait, how do I actually see your humanity and where you need to grow? And how do I make sure you're seeing my humanity and where I need to grow? And that includes that you need to support me growing my leadership, right? Through the unknown. And I think one of the things that white people have the hardest time with is like, but you're making a mistake. It's not perfect, right? Because that's a part of white supremacist culture, is this concept of perfection, this concept of like, everything has to be right. It has to be right the first time. You can't show anybody until it's just right, okay? That's not how we do in a movement. That's not how we're doing it. We're like, it's a mess. It's a mess. It's a riot. It's a rebellion. Some of these people never thought about this before yesterday, and we're all here doing this. It's not going to be neat and clean and tidy and look, all together. Now that does not, the other counter to that is, it doesn't mean that Black culture is chaos, right? Black culture has been survival. Black culture has been making a way out of no way. Black culture has been like, okay, if this is the small window of opportunity, we'll blast through this window. That's how we are still here. The only reason Black people are still alive is because we've been willing to adapt inside of chaotic conditions for the sake of our aliveness. And what we're doing is, in some ways, asking white people, take leadership from us, right? And it's very easy, sometimes I ask, like, not just what would Harriet do, right? Because people's like, oh, Harriet Tubman, she freed all these people. I'm like, yeah, but where would you have been in relationship to Harriet? Would you have been holding her back? Would you have been arguing with her about which way she was going? Where would you have been in relationship to her? Would you have been one of the white people on the Underground Railroad who knew they didn't have to say anything to Harriet Tubman, but just give her a place to sleep and support her physical needs and support her and keep it moving, right? So I think we're in this, I think it's a great moment to figure out, how do we upend the constructs while also like destroying the constructs, right? I'm like, whiteness is actually the construct that is most needs to fall apart right now. And when we give white people a chance to follow Blackness and follow indigeneity and follow immigrants and follow other people, we're actually giving white people an opportunity for their own redemption. Not to shrink themselves, not to deny themselves, but actually to live into something beyond this tiny, torturous container of whiteness that has no lineage and no culture and no connection to earth and no connection to liberation. So, I'm like, we call it a Black liberation movement, but really it is a liberation movement. Like, every single person who's showing up, I'm like, this is for Black people's freedom, but your freedom is tied to how you show up for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you've perfectly described, I think, a lot of the stuff that's happening in Asheville, like in the conversations we've been having, preparing for the summer.
Yeah.
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 Thank you. I can't wait to watch this recording and listen to that everything again. Okay, folks, so we're opening it up for questions. And I'm not sure, Megan Clay, if you had a question or if you just were.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to make a comment, but London pretty much made my comment.
Okay, cool. Anybody else want to jump in? This is your opportunity. Greenleaf.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that stood out to me in Emergent Strategy, A&B, is your use of the word gossip, and I was curious if you could speak a little bit more to that. I've seen gossip used before in these spaces as actually like a source of solidarity. It's node-based communication. It's a generative way for us to develop shared reality.
Yeah.
In the absence of impositional authority. Like, it's basically kind of like side conversations that allowed us to conduct node-based de-hierarchized communication. And I see the way it's used a lot in emergent strategy as something that's seen as destructive rather than generative. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on the context of that word and why it shows up for you as destructive rather than generative, and insight you have on that.
I appreciate that. You know, I love to gossip. I think most people do. Like, there's a bonding and a belonging that comes from being able to stay with someone and be like, look at that person, right? And be able to share knowledge, share information about what's going on. It's our human nature. I think we've always had it. The way that I'm talking about an emergent strategy is when the tendency to talk about and to pull apart other people, or to share private information of other people, you know, to whisper it around with the effort of pulling them down or dismissing their work. I think then we get involved in something that can be very dangerous, because we are, you know, we're all actually pretty precarious. All of us, all of our organizations, all of our institutions, we're all relying on, for the most part, those who are nonprofit funded organizations are relying on funding that is trend based from people who have wealth and who can change their mind at any time. We have not unlocked and liberated the economic resources of movement. And so far, every time any organization starts to amass anything that can come close to wealth, gossip tears it apart before that can be turned into something like, oh, we figured out how to start an endowment or something for movement from those resources. And when that thing falls apart, the resources all go flowing back to wealth. And I'm like, oh, gossip is what allows that to happen. So I also think organizational gossip is part of where the danger comes. Instead of saying we have political differences with that organization, right? We actually have a different political stance than that organization. Sometimes instead of doing that, we gossip about them to sow seeds of discontent, right? It's a very competitive behavior. There's a way that it can be very much like, we're better than them. We're better than them, and we're better than them. And what I see happen inside of movements is it can become a very isolating behavior. If we're better than everyone else, no one can be our comrade. No one can be in right relationship. We can't actually build the broad united fronts that we actually need in order to advance something larger than capitalism, than white supremacy, right? These are massive systems. And if you look at white supremacy, white people have every kind of opinion that you can imagine, right? They have every kind of opinion. I mean, my family, the white family lineage is all from South Carolina. And it blows my mind how divergent those white opinions can be. But they'll come together when it's like, oh, hold up, we're not letting a Black person get into power. Like, then all of a sudden, all those differences blur into one thing. And they're not all gossiping about each other. They're like, white. It blows my mind. And so I'm like, if we want something bigger than we have right now, bigger than the scraps and the handouts and the oppression and everything else, we have to practice a solidarity that is bigger. And that, to me, I think putting down the gossip behavior can really help with that. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have those interpersonal things. There's in the book that's coming out, I talk about principal struggle. And it's a model from Marxism that I learned from Tanya Lee, who's part of Left Roots. And we talk about how side conversations can help us vent and process and release our frustration, which is also human nature. We get on each other's fucking nerves. Like, I mean, we just do, right? Because we're different signs, different birth orders, different politics, whatever it is. Some people just annoying, right? All of that is there. But in Principal Struggle, we talk about how could we bring the essence of those side conversations back to serve the whole. And I think that's always important. Is if I'm in a conversation that's checking me out of the process, where I'm like, these people suck, and so I'm not going to be a part of them, then that's where I have to start to be cautious, right? As I'm like, oh, am I using this to basically relinquish my responsibility for movement, to basically relinquish my responsibility for community and for what's happening here? Because we can do that. We can gossip ourselves out of feeling responsible for what's happening. And then no one feels responsible because everyone's got a strong gossipy opinion about each other. And then chaos of that doesn't grow us ensues. So that's for me the essence of it, where I'm like, it's fine. We all have the side conversations. We all, girl, did you hear? You know, that's human nature. But if it gets to the place where it keeps us from being able to practice solidarity, then we need to really check ourselves. And in most of the organizations I've ever been in leadership in, that's been one of our practices, is we don't gossip about other organizations. If we hold a political difference, we hold that political difference with integrity. We may not partner with them on close projects. We might only do broad scale alliance work with them, but that way we're not building our sense of belonging with each other by being better than them, right? Because that can take up all your time and all your energy. And then, one other thing is, if you're gossiping in one place, it's hard not to gossip in every place. And if you're gossiping with your friends and then philanthropy comes and asks you, what do you think about this landscape? It's very hard not to let that gossiping flow into that space, right? And all of a sudden now it's like, oh, that gossip meant that that organization, which might have been led by a Black queer person or something, is now not going to get funding because you planted a seed of doubt with that, which may or may not be true, piece of gossip. I've seen that happen so many times where people are like, oh, I didn't even realize that the thing I was talking about could lead to such tangible results for someone else. So, yeah.
Do I have a moment to ask a follow-up on that?
Sure.
Thank you for sharing your wisdom on that. And I find that the word gossip for me also shows up in the way that the Me Too movement was catalyzed by survivors being able to talk with each other outside of the auspices of authority figures that they were trying to
but that's
resist.
not gossip. Those are people telling the truths, right? And I think
Okay.
that is a big distinction. Like, to me, gossip is something that's like, I heard about it, telephone game. I don't actually necessarily know about this, but I'm passing this along. Like, it's not gossip if I'm like, this person touched me. I'm telling you about it. I want you to know about it, right? Like, that's my actual story, me telling you my actual story. And so many people now starting to be able to come forward and say, here's what happened to me, right? I think that's true for me too. I think that's true for most of our movements right now. They're rooted in, I'm going to tell you the truth about what's happening to me. And now I think we're in a new level of, what do we do with that? What do we do when the truth comes out? What do we do when we recognize that all of us are causing harm and all of us are having harm caused to us, that all of that's happening concurrently? How do we actually then have solidarity? How do we actually then have movements that don't just fall apart because we're all bad people and there's only one innocent person in the whole world, right? So to me, that's the distinction I would hold there is, I've had people gossip on me and I felt that experience. I'm like, oh, that's something that's not true, but you've decided to tell everyone it's true. And now I have to decide, am I going to spend time on this thing that's not true? Or am I going to spend time continuing to build the things that I know are true? And then am I going to continue to tell my stories of what has happened in my life? And I think that's a big thing because I'm like, I'm not flawless, like I've definitely had impact in my life. I know I've caused harm in my life and I've been very accountable for that harm. Like I have turned and faced, I have had those conversations, I've engaged in those processes. If something is true, I work on it, right? And I think we want to set that as a condition, right? That it's like truth gets attended to, truth gets held, truth gets talked to. It makes it very confusing then if we're also sharing gossip as if it is truth. If we don't start to develop a culture of discernment within movement, that's really what We Will Not Cancel Us as a booklet is about. It's like, how do we learn to even ask the question, to be like, where did you hear that? Where did you hear that? Where are you sourcing that information from, right? Show me the receipts. Show me what you have on that. Like, how can I believe this? How can I know this? Especially if the person you're being told this gossip about is a Black woman, a Black trans person, like someone who's in movement for a long time. I think the other thing is, I would be remiss not to say there's a huge connection between gossip and infiltration, right? That there are so many people who want to see our movements fail. And if you can easily plant any old seed and it will flourish, it becomes very easy to plant seeds of infiltration throughout movement spaces. And that to me is, I'm like, have we learned nothing from COINTELPRO? Have we learned nothing about how, like, when we are successful, people will come and try to sow those seeds of dissent and divergence? So for me, I'm like, okay, well, let's ask this question. You know, last week I posted a piece. I was talking about how Black women get under these attacks, and so many of them are fed by gossip. And it doesn't mean that those women are innocent, right? Like my friend Patrice Cullors is under attack right now. I'm like, doesn't mean that she's innocent. Doesn't mean she hasn't ever done anything wrong. But the things that she is being accused of in this way, I'm like, oh, if people only knew the truth of what was going on, their minds would be blown. And I think a lot of people would be really embarrassed about what they are participating in. But gossip allows us to participate in things that shake the foundation so much that it becomes hard to build anything on them. And I think we have to and I think we're babies at this. I think like in 20 years from now, we'll be in a very different place with what movements know how to do around mediation, around community accountability, around discernment. You know, I'm writing as fast as I can to put out all the tools I know. Miriam Kaba and Shir Hassan put out this book, Fumbling Towards Repair, that's like, here's how we actually do community accountability processes. Like, there's so many tools coming out so people can be like, oh, if we have a beef in our community, here's how we handle it. It doesn't just have to be like we gossip about it, we call each other out on the internet, and then if nothing happens, that person feels punished, and then everybody moves on. Like, we need something better. We need better processes for accountability. So I'm really excited for what's unfolding, but this is the birth canal. You know, we are in the dark, it's really closed in, and it's like, how do we breathe inside of this? You know, we're really in there right now. So yeah.
Thank you. There was this question submitted to me from Lisa Capel, who is a faculty member who's shared your ideas and books with lots of people on this campus. She asked, she said she's curious to hear your thoughts on the role of the academy within movement work. If the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, what can university students, faculty, staff do to dismantle dominator systems? And how can we be in it, but not of it? I think that's a big question for all of us.
I love this question. You know, I mean, I think academies, institutions, right? Like, everything's falling apart and everything's going to fall apart. And I think if you can be in it with that knowing, it's like, it's all falling apart and it's going to fall apart. That's the good news. And then what we create in those spaces, that's what we are going to shape. I will say this. Some of the most exciting learning that I got to do that shaped my organizing, my activism, happened while I was a student, right? It happened while I was a student, both organizing against things that were happening at my academy. So I was at Columbia University. We were organizing for divestment campaigns. We were doing, you know, like, how does this university spend its resources? Amadou Diallo was killed while I was a student. And so I had the room and the space to start doing what has now become a huge part of my work. Before I had the language of abolition, I was doing work to figure out, like, how do we stop the police from causing this harm? I think that for students, the academy can be in a really incredible supportive space to get to practice being a community and being an activist, right? So I'm like, you know, take good classes if you can. But to me, the heart of it is you're in an enclosed community where you can actually see, what are the patterns? How do I create change in this space? How do I lift a conversation up in this space? You know, and some of it can be resourced, right? You can actually be like, oh, we got funds for our community group to go do this or could do that. It's a great place to learn. It's a great place to make mistakes. It's a great place to, like, put your foot in your mouth. It's a great place to figure out, do you enjoy being a leader or not, right? Like, what I found was I'm the kind of person who, because of how I talk and whatever, you know, I'm a writer. So I'm like, I write paragraphs when I'm talking. And so people are like, oh, you're a leader. I'm like, no, I'm a writer. And what I found was I knew by the end of college that facilitation was my gift. I didn't want to be the person in the front of the room giving the talk. I wanted to figure out, how do we hold this room so that everyone can talk? And that's something I figured out in college. And so that's my biggest piece, is like, use the experience to be inside of community. And then also, a lot of times people who are in the academy as teachers and professors they're also trapped. And I think, you know, when I was younger, I looked at them, I was like, oh, you're part of the institution. What I now understand is so many of those people are like, they're in the institution, but also trying to create change and foment change. So I think one of the things students can do and one of the things faculty can do is see themselves as allies, see themselves as like, we could work together here. I think students can help faculty to get tenure, right? To organize on behalf of faculty that they love getting tenure, because once you get tenure, you can take so many more risks as a faculty member in terms of what you can actually do. It's really, really hard to speak up and be honest in the system when you don't have tenure. Now, I'm outside of the faculty. I'm outside of the I don't even know what you call it. I'm outside of the academy. So all this stuff is like stuff I see in my comrades who are in it. And I also find a lot, you know, for women, for people of color, for people from oppressed identities, being inside the academy is also a very violent experience. And so one of the things I recommend for faculty is make sure that you're actually organizing with each other. Don't have an isolated competitive experience as faculty members, right? Don't be in there and let yourselves be pit against each other. The more you can organize for and support each other, the better it is for every single person at that institution. The one thing I will say, because I saw briefly, I can't follow the chat fully, but I saw someone be like, don't make me drop out. And I'm like, you know, the beautiful thing is it's everywhere you look, and not beautiful, horrible thing, but it's like everywhere you look, there's institution. So it's like, if you're not in the academy, if you drop out of the academy, you'll just go to some other institution, right? You'll go to a job institution, you'll go to a bank institution, you go somewhere else. So this is one of the things that's been beautiful to me, is I always was like, movement is so unique. We're not institutions. No, bitch, we are all institutions. It's all institutions everywhere, right? What you are going to decide is, which institution can you affect the most change at? Which institution allows you to actually be most fully yourself? Which institution do you feel like you can commit to changing? Because none of them, all of them are swimming inside of capitalism and white supremacy culture. There's no institution that you can go to that's outside of that, unless you decide to really go live off the grid and off on land and all of that, which I highly recommend. 10 for 10 recommend, you know, but you have to give up social media to do that. So all the things, right? But to me, it's like recognizing that any institution you go to is a place for you to be like, this is where I'm going to put my foot down, and I'm going to combat capitalism, and I'm going to combat racism, and I'm going to be my whole self, and I'm going to stop sexual assault. Like wherever it is you land, that's where you have to do the work. And Grace Lee Boggs, you know, one of the lessons she taught me was we have to transform ourselves to transform the world. So the sooner you can flip that in your head, that it's not just this institution that has to change. You have to change how you are in ways that transform that institution and that transforms every single space. That's the good news. Now, you know, I flunked out of college, so take it all with a grain of salt. All right, we're at 1
Something
o'clock.
that we like talked about to like try and make it so that people get tenure that are doing that work is saying like anti-racism work is something you have to be doing to get tenure. And like they literally like have never had an equity and inclusion evaluation on the student feedback on instruction until this school year. Like,
yes, and there's like
just
things like that it's like that could be the legacy of your generation, right? The legacy of my generation, when I was at Columbia, they didn't have like ethnic studies, right? It was like we had been in this battle around having scholarship that wasn't just white supremacist scholarship, white based scholarship, and we had a massive struggle for ethnic studies. And this was, you know, I graduated in 2000. Right? So it's like, think it's really actually great to think, what is the legacy that your generation could actually have on that institution, right? If you're going to be there, make that demand, make that shift, and make it not just for yourself, but think 7 generations ahead. That's the Indigenous worldview that works, right? It's like, okay, in 7 generations, even if there's not colleges, we do want to have a culture where people openly speak about race and power dynamics, right? What can I do right here, right now to create that future?
Thank you. That's beautiful. 7 generations ahead. Okay, y'all, I want to be respectful of Adrienne's time. It's 1:02, and I know you all have other classes. So I put in the link in the chat, the link for registering for tonight's keynote. If you have more questions or just want to also soak in more, please come back tonight at 7. We'll have a time for more Q&A. And I want to just sort of pass it to Megan real quickly to wrap us up.
Yeah, y'all are wonderful. I tell many of the students who are in this space today how incredible they are and how much I learned from them. So I'm always honored to be in space with them where I can do little of the talking and they can do most of it because they are geniuses. So again, thank you all so much for coming. Adrienne, thank you so much for being in community with us here. And again, later on tonight, we look forward to the keynote and everything that you'll be discussing. And we will see you all at 7. Thanks, everybody.